So the second part of this section of Chapter 9 is about incentives. The first thing I want to do is kind of introduce your Dropbox assignment in this section. Really what I want you to do is look at all three of these, look at these three different consumption methods. Imagine you're in a scenario where your organization, your sport organization, is trying to or has seen a decline in their consumption. So this is professional college ticket sales, health club membership sales, sponsorship sales. I want you to pick one of these categories in your Dropbox assignment, and I want you to answer basically this dilemma. Your job is to determine ways to increase their consumption. We'll talk about different incentives here in just a second and the basics of it, and then talk about some categories in the next video. But I want you to go beyond theory. Go beyond just the some definitions that we're using. I want you to think about actual actions that you can take, real things that you could do in this scenario to help increase consumption, because that's essentially what incentives are all about. So again, as a review, pick one of these three areas. Act like your job is to increase consumption in either ticket sales, membership sales, or sponsorship sales. And I want you to come up with actual things that you can do to increase that consumption. So let's talk about incentives. First of all, incentives are, like I just mentioned, offered to encourage consumption. So what is consumption? Consumption, in the most simplest form, is a purchase, but it can include other things. So consumption is the purchase in the form of either goods, services. It could also mean just going to a website. So many times we have media. That doesn't require purchase, yet they increase their revenue by viewership. And so when I'm talking about media, I'm talking about online sources. So I go to a blog or a news site where you get that information for free, but their sponsors expect to have high levels of viewership or clicks on their page so that more people see their ads. And so we're talking about in consumption, we're talking about things that could be a purchase or visits. It could be sponsorship, it could be tickets. In other words, increasing the consumer's use of something, either a purchase or an element. So incentives, they're defined as items of perceived value that are added to an offer in order to encourage some, and this is the key word here, overt behavioral response. I mentioned this before. They are offered to consumers who are insufficiently motivated, they're indifferent about the product, or they're apathetic with respect to that proposed behavior. In other words, an incentive is put into place to try to encourage you to do something. That is, purchase something, increase your consumption. And so incentives are used when there is a low demand. Incentives are really never used if the demand is very high or you have a shortage of whatever it is that you're producing. So we have to go back to this idea of the value function. This idea of the value function is a kind of a consumer behavior price type of understanding. But you can see on this axis, we see on the vertical axis we have value. Essentially the higher values on the top, low values on the bottom. A consumer makes a decision about their purchase as either being a loss or a gain. Now they're comparing this to other options, things they could have done instead. But incentives' jobs are to alter the perceived price or perceived benefit of an offer in order to overcome some sort of indifference, like I mentioned, or any type of resistance they have in the product. In other words, incentives' job is to move them to the top right of this image. You can see that a consumer that feels like they have a higher value, they feel like they have a gain out of the purchase. But if they have a lower value, they have a loss. One unique thing to look at this in the value function is that as you get closer to having a low value or a value less than 1, so to speak, you see a dramatic drop off. You can see that these lines are not an equal S. It's a sharper drop off in value to a loss as opposed to a gain. So in other words, incentives' jobs are to ensure that people don't feel like there is a low value or a loss that comes from the purchase. So let's talk about incentives. The whole key or the whole point to an incentive is that you're adding value. Value added is the term that many marketers use. What value added characteristics are you creating for your product? This idea is grounded in the basic principle of consumer behavior. Consumers want to buy products, and they do that by adding value to the things that they're buying. Or they're buying things that add value to their life. Sorry. So one thing that we look at, it goes back to the very beginning of this entire class, is this idea of utility. If you remember, utility is the want-satisfying power of a good or service. So a consumer, in other words, a consumer purchases something, and utility is why they purchase it. The marketer is able to provide some utility to the customer. So if I have a want, the product, if it is adding value, is satisfying that want by purchasing the good or the service. So what are some common types of incentives? The most common type of incentive is a price-based incentive. In other words, a discount, a coupon, a free trial. In other words, we're trying to lower the price to entice you or to encourage some sort of overt behavior, increase consumption, and we do this by trying to give you a discount. So again, this is important to understand that incentives are only used when there is a low demand. Because if you have a high demand for your product, you don't need to offer a discount because people are going to buy it for full price. But one of the biggest risks of common risk of using price promotions or price-based incentives is that you may be devaluing the image of your product. So if you're constantly doing price promotions to try to sell this product, you may be inadvertently sending a message to the consumer that it is of low quality. And so that's why it's important, when we talked about in chapter 12, to price your items according to consumers' perceptions of value. You don't want to overprice it assuming that you're going to make a lot more money. If we're in an elastic demand curve, we know that that is actually incorrect. To increase your revenue, increase your price will increase revenue. We know that's not true. So we have to ensure that price-based promotions are only used when there is a low demand, because essentially we're trying to get consumers to try the product so they'll come back and buy that at full price later. One of the more common types, and we talked about this in chapter 12, was discounting. And this is an effective pricing strategy when the target product is losing demand. And so if you're starting to have a surplus, and so you see the biggest risk is heavily too much on those discounts, which removes that perceived value. And it may also damage your relationship with your full-paying customers. If you're constantly reducing your ticket prices to games, your season ticket holders are going to go, look, I might as well just buy a bunch of individual tickets because they're getting it for cheaper than I am, and I'm actually giving you a lot more money in doing it. So you have to be careful with discounting too often. So another type of, so the most common is price-based promotions and incentives. Another type of incentive that is very popular is this idea of the contingency-based price promotion or contingency-based incentive. Essentially, contingency-based is when a consumer gives something up in order to receive the discount. And what we mean is they give something up. It's contingent on them giving us something in order for them to get something in return. This is most commonly used to try to gain information about a consumer. We'll give you the discount, but you need to register with us your account. And in that account, you give us your email address, your phone number, your name, etc. The reason they do this is obviously they're trying to gain more information so that they can figure out who their target market is, who you are, so they can try to sell to you in the future. But you are hopefully going to do it so that you can get that discount or get that incentive. You also might include a purchase requirement. And so oftentimes you hear the phrase, no purchase necessary. Well, a contingency-based price promotion or contingency-based incentive could require a purchase. That could be the contingency. You may also have to possess some sort of personal characteristic. And so, for example, we talked about in chapter 12, price discrimination. That is essentially an incentive. So you're giving a discount to college students. You're doing it by age. You're trying to get that age group in because you know they're more likely to come back in the future when it is full price. Or some sort of social status. You're an alumni, and so you get a discount because you're an alumni. That's, again, an incentive that's based on certain characteristics. So, again, contingency basis, you have to give something up in order to receive the discount. Another type is the premium giveaway. This is a giveaway that enhances the entertainment aspect We know through research that this actually increases attendance in sporting events by up to 8%. So these will be things such as hats, cups, t-shirts, or what I've got on the screen, which is one of my favorite bobbleheads that I have. It's actually behind me. Yeah, right behind me too. But it is bobbleheads. We know the bobbleheads are a big part of what is effective. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the biggest concern we have, or the group that gives us the biggest concern when it comes to incentives, is cherry pickers. The biggest concern we have with incentives is attracting cherry pickers, and that term basically means patrons who only come when there are incentives. In other words, they're the ones that are seeking out the bobbleheads, and they only come when there's a bobblehead night. While we know that that might help us in the short run, it obviously gets them into the facility. But if you think of the people who are just looking for discounts, in all likelihood they're people who have either a lower spending power or are extremely price sensitive and will do everything they can to save money. And so if you're trying to attract people to an event just to raise awareness, then incentives might work and cherry pickers may not be an issue. However, incentives again are trying to encourage some sort of behavior, some increase in consumption. If they're only coming because of the incentive, then they're not actually increasing consumption. You're actually just giving away things to people who are never going to come back unless you give them something in return. And so really, cherry pickers, those people who only come because there are incentives, don't really impact our sales in the long run. That's what our research shows us. So if you're only attracting people who are coming out for the incentive itself, then you may not actually be your outcome may not actually be what you want from an incentive. So what are some of the most top 10 effective giveaways? We talked about those premium giveaways. Jack in the Box, travel mug, ring, and today most of the argument is bobbleheads, stuffed animals, puzzles, backpack, notebook, clock, and figurine or figures. These are things that people come to games for. And the last thing I want to talk about in this part of the basics of incentives is this idea of the Monday through Thursday problem. We primarily see this in baseball, but it gives us a good example in a lot of sports. The Monday through Thursday problem is that in baseball specifically, you may have a 8 to 12 game homestand, which means you have 8 to 12 games in a row, one a day for 8 to 12 games. You may have problems trying to increase attendance. And so we know that specifically the games that give us the most problems are those Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday games. We know through research that these are the lower demanded games, and oftentimes incentives are offered to try to increase the number of people at these games. And so these promotions, we know that by offering promotions or different types of incentives through the Monday through Thursday time period, specifically in baseball, we know in Major League Baseball that by doing this, we are able to increase our attendance by 14% every time we do it. And so we know that incentives work on the Monday through Thursday problem. We also try to change the way we price our products on our Monday through Thursday. In baseball specifically, they've gone to this idea of dynamic pricing, which I mentioned in Chapter 12. Dynamic pricing is focusing on demand, both high and low demand. And so for games on Monday through Thursday, you might be pricing your products really low or lower than the average. And on a Friday, Saturday night, you might be pricing them higher. And those might change minute by minute and day by day. And they use algorithms. One of the companies that's a leader in this is this company called QQ, and they're based out of Austin. If you're more interested in hearing about dynamic pricing, I would suggest you go look up QQ.